Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I am Matthew Silverman, the director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program titled Shopkeepers to Scrap Dealers to Specialists, the Jewish Community of Madison, Wisconsin, with Professor Jonathan Pollack. Over the past couple of years, we have explored different pockets of Jewish life through the United States. For those of you who have missed our previous American Jewish Life lectures, I invite you to watch recordings posted on our website. To mention a couple, we have explored Jewish life in Virginia and more broadly, Jewish life in the South and in Texas. This summer, we are examining Jewish American history in the Midwest. I look forward to exploring some significant narratives in the history and experiences of Midwestern Jewish life. For one, the Midwest is one of the few regions I myself have not lived in before. Our next lecture will explore Steeltown Jews, the history and legacy of Homestead, Pennsylvania, on August 3rd with Tammy Hepst. We'll send a link to register as part of our follow-up materials. I hope you all will be able to join us for that program also. Before moving on to this evening, I would like to mention that we are beginning a new sponsorship opportunity this year. Sponsoring a lecture or class is a meaningful way to celebrate an accomplishment or to honor or memorialize a loved one. More information will be emailed in a few weeks. In the meantime, feel free to reach out to us. As we plan for the coming year, we would love to hear your ideas for lectures or class topics that you would like to sponsor. On a logistical note, please use the Q&A button to ask questions. Most questions will be discussed at the end of the lecture. At times, we may open up the chat for some specific questions that our speaker will ask. And now, to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jonathan Pollack earned his PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has been a full-time instructor in history at the Madison Area Technical College since 1998, where he teaches courses in American and immigration history. He has published articles in the Journal of Jewish Identities, American Jewish History, and Business History. He has been an honorary fellow in Wisconsin Center for Jewish Studies since 2012. In 2019, Dr. Pollack published the book, Wisconsin, the New Home of the Jew, 150 Years of Jewish Life at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And from 2014 to 2022, he served as a scholar and consultant on the museum exhibit, Scrapyard, Innovators of Recycling, for the Jewish Museum Maryland and the Jewish Museum Milwaukee. Thank you all again for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Pollack. The screen is now yours.
All right. Thank you, Matthew, for that intro. And thanks to everybody who's joining us this evening. Wow, we're up to 196 participants. If we can hustle up 4 more, we'll be at a solid 200. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming out. So the first thing I want to do is and this might be up already. We kind of worked this out right before we began this evening, but we've got a poll up, and I'm just kind of curious how many people here this evening have personal connections to Madison. Whether you lived here at some point, whether you were born here, whether you went to school here. If you could just enter any Madison connections you have, filling out our poll. And then Rebecca and I will kind of go over that just to kind of see like what we know already. Okay, great. So 116 people have participated. We'll just give it another few seconds for people to click in. All right. So, oh, great. So we've got the results. So we've got 26% of the people are UW alums. That's great to hear. 14% are from Madison. 5% are here. So hi, those of you who are in from Madison. There's a good chance you've maybe seen some of this material before. So hi again, and thanks for coming back. Be sure to correct me if I say something different than I said when you saw me speak about this before. All right, great. Thank you for answering the poll, and thank you for tuning in this evening. Oh, I see people I know in the chat. This is wonderful. All right, so I want to start out by just kind of talking about Madison as an example of kind of American Jewish history and really global Jewish history. That one of the things that's really it's really been clear to me in my research is that whenever we look at Jewish migration, that Jewish people have historically moved for jobs, like lots of other immigrants. That if we ask a question like, how did the first Jewish people get to place X? The answer is, well, somebody probably thought they could make a living at it. Somebody thought it was a good place to settle. Early on, this is a kind of a difficult decision for especially observant Jews to make, because of course Judaism requires a minyan to have like a fully legit service. For people who keep kosher, requires people with long time training in practice of kashrut and the inspection of kashrut and so forth. So it takes a special kind of person to be that first Jewish person to live somewhere. So this is a theme that's really going to kind of go through my talk. Is that Madison is a place, and I suspect most cities, when we look at them, you might have heard about this with Virginia, you might hear about this with Homestead, Pennsylvania coming up soon, that people have moved there because it seemed like a good gig. It was a place where they could settle. So when we talk about Madison, when I began my research into Madison's Jewish community, there was a book that a local rabbi put out in 1956, the 100th anniversary of the first Jewish services, the first Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services in Madison. And in that book, it talked about a man named Samuel Klauber as the first Jew in Madison. And really and truly, if you're going to identify the first Jewish person to settle in your community, Samuel Klauber is a fabulous choice. Klauber was an almost immediate success in business. He had a store on the Capitol Square in Madison, the old central business district that he acquired in 1851, and it thrived for another 36 years until his death in 1887. The store employed lots of people. It was known as just a high quality store. Klauber was active in lots of activities in the German community here in Madison. He was involved in German singing societies and German language Masonic lodges. He hosted the first services in his house in what's now downtown Madison in 1856. He was the major contributor to the synagogue building that was eventually built. And when the synagogue went under in 1879, once the Jewish community had dwindled to the point they couldn't really maintain a synagogue, and the remaining community leased it out to the local Unitarian Church, Klauber joined the First Unitarian Society and became an active member there. And his eulogy in the Madison papers when he died was actually written by the Unitarian minister at that time. Wonderful, wonderful story. Unfortunately, Klauber was not the first Jew to live in Madison. And in point of fact, by looking at the Dun & Company records, the predecessor to Dun & Bradstreet, the credit rating agency, by looking at old Dun & Company records, essentially running Klauber's credit, I was able to find out that Klauber bought his store from Aaron Boskowitz, another Jew who had settled in Madison about a year prior. Aaron Boskowitz and his son Ignatz came to Madison by 1850. They opened a small store that was not a success. They moved on to Mineral Point, Wisconsin. As you might guess by its name, Mineral Point was the main city in Wisconsin's zinc and lead mining region in the southwestern part of the state. And the Boskowitzes set up shop there. Aaron Boskowitz came back to the first services in 1856, but after that he was gone, eventually making his way into fur trading and heading further westward from Minneapolis on to the West Coast. So the first Jews in Madison were actually really transient. They were here for a short time, looks like about a year or so, before moving on and doing something else. And I think this story is also really typical. I mean, as we'll be talking about later on, and as several of you mentioned in the poll and the subsequent chats that I've been able to see, that a lot of people came to Madison for college, an ultimate sort of transient experience. Lots of people go somewhere for college. They have 4 years there. and they move on and go somewhere else. Maybe they come back for the occasional reunion. Maybe they come back to visit. Maybe their kid follows in their footsteps and goes there, but they ultimately settle somewhere else. So, so early on in Madison, as I kind of pointed out in the Shopkeepers part of the title to this talk, the Jews who came to Madison in the mid 19th century opened general stores and clothing stores. Many of them went into business with each other. The records of this period show lots of partnerships between between Jewish entrepreneurs in Madison, who came from two main areas, from Bohemia in the modern day Czech Republic, and from the city of Kirpen near Köln in Germany. Jews often came here as peddlers, selling stuff door to door, sent out by wholesale houses in cities like New York, Milwaukee, Cincinnati, Chicago, and Baltimore. So Jews kind of came here as agents of bigger houses in other cities to the east, and found it a decent place to settle. It's a city that's always grown. Madison has never lost population in its history, and it was a place to settle. After the first services that I've mentioned in 1856, 7 years later, the Jews in Madison had raised enough money to build a synagogue. It was originally located 2 blocks away from the state capitol, 2 blocks west of the Capitol on West Washington Avenue, for those of you who know the city. And it was a Reform temple. The minutes reveal that there was some debate about what minchag, or what style of service they were going to have. And they settled on Isaac Mayer Wise's Minhag America. Isaac Mayer Wise, of course, was one of the founders of American Reform Judaism, one of the founders of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. So it's very clearly Reform. The building, which still exists, it was moved from its original site in 1971 to its current resting place in James Madison Park on Lake Mendota in Madison. If you've been in the building, you see there's a small balcony up top that you walk in the door, and there's a small main floor, and then above is a balcony. That balcony is original to the building, and that balcony was built as a choir loft. A choir entertained the audience, sang at the dedication of the synagogue in September of 1863. And from looking at the records, there's maybe one other time where they were able to muster a choir to sing there. The choir they got for the initial ceremony included a bunch of ringers, included music professors and music students at the University of Wisconsin who were not Jewish, but nonetheless came to sing for this one purpose. The community struggled to keep a rabbi. The initial rabbi they hired came for a few months in 1866, found that he couldn't make a living on what they were able to pay him as a rabbi, so he opened a store. The store failed, and he got a better offer from the Jewish congregation in La Crosse, Wisconsin, a bigger Jewish community than Madison at that time in the 1860s. The rabbi who came to Madison, the first rabbi in Madison, was a man named Joseph Thuringer. And like many American rabbis throughout the 19th century, Thuringer was not fully ordained. Thuringer appears to have attended rabbinical school in Germany for a few years, but left short of graduation. He was working as a clerk in a train station at the time that his brother, Samuel Thuringer, called him to Madison and asked him to be their rabbi. And Thuringer's career as rabbi was on again, off again. He on one occasion, he threatened his resignation. He offered his resignation, and the synagogue board refused to take it. And they said, no, we're not letting you resign. You have to stay in as rabbi. A couple years later, they fired him. A couple years after that, they hired him back. So Joseph Thuringer also had to kind of make his way doing other things. He worked in his brother's store. He taught German lessons to people who wanted a private German tutor, and moved to Chicago when the synagogue failed in 1879. You could ask a reasonable question: why did the synagogue fail? And this is something that earlier historians of Madison's Jewish community kind of shrugged their shoulders and said it just kind of went away. It just didn't work anymore. Looking through credit reports of Jacob Lentz, one of the biggest Jewish merchants in Madison. Lentz owned properties. He owned a brewery in Chicago. He owned real estate all over Dane County, the Madison metropolitan area. He had grocery stores. He had a distillery. He had lots of property, and the credit reports on this guy are fascinating because they kind of go two ways. Some of the credit evaluators say this guy is absolutely a wizard. He buys up these properties and everything succeeds, and he's just getting bigger and bigger. And other credit evaluators said, no, he's a little too sharp. He's a little too slick. There's no way he can afford to pay all these mortgages that he's piling up here. Something's going to blow up someday. In 1873, that's exactly what happened. As banks started to fail in New York City, Lentz lost his money. He could not pay back his creditors. And in April of 1873, Lentz fled Madison for Victoria in British Columbia. Lentz left behind a tide of red ink dumped off on his former partners within the Jewish community. People like Samuel Klauber, who partnered briefly with Lentz in the 1860s, but did not keep that partnership going. Klauber remained solvent, and people who allied with him, people who cast in their lot with the financial wizard Jacob Lentz, found themselves holding the bag afterwards, and their credit rating really suffered. They had to take clerk jobs for other people. They had to leave Madison. They had to go somewhere to start over because in Madison they were ruined. So we can really trace to like a series of business connections that both boosted this early Jewish community of shopkeepers and also proved to be its downfall. There were early on one of the other Jewish families in Madison who had a successful hide and skin business beginning in the 1860s and going into the 1920s. Were the Cook brothers, Emmanuel, Henry, and Jacob Cook. And the Cook brothers provide us with a nice bridge to my next area, to scrap dealers. That even though the Jewish presence in the scrap industry is often kind of pegged to the 1890s with large-scale Jewish immigration from, with a larger scale Jewish immigration from Poland and other spots in the Russian Empire. The fact of the matter is that there were Jewish people repurposing goods like hides and skins long before that. Hides and skins later on would be kind of the first thing that lots of people got out of a story I'll go into in a few minutes. But before I do that, I want to give people another chance to interact. And for this one, we want people. Let's see. Oh, there's a bunch of. Okay, so we got some questions here. So Rebecca, I just want to go over what we talked about ahead of time. We want people to post their answers to this next question in the chat. Is that correct?
We're all set.
Okay, great. So the question is, I'm curious, and this is something that I see there's at least one person who saw one of the presentations I did in relation to the scrap exhibit. That's what I kind of kicked off that with. I'm curious, is there anyone here who has a family connection to the scrap business, whether you yourself currently maintain a scrapyard or owned one earlier, whether this is something that your parents or grandparents did? Are there people who have this sort of connection? If you have one, if you don't need to mention it. But if you do, I'm curious about where those scrapyards were located. So we're just going to give a few minutes for people to put their info in the chat. Again, if you don't have those connections, you don't need to put anything in there. If you did, just kind of put in the place, the city, the state, the region where those scrapyards were. Excellent. Oh yeah. All right. So a lot of people with Madison connections. I saw Whitewater, several people from Madison, relatives of the Alters in Davenport. We'll be talking about later on. Lancaster, Ohio. Wow. Okay. So yeah. So Lancaster, Ohio. You could have dealt with your grandfather could have dealt with my grandfather, who had a scrapyard was in scrap in Springfield, Ohio, and Dayton, Ohio, Janesville. Okay, wow. I'm seeing like relatives of people I've seen, like whose names I've seen in the archives, and it's interesting to see them here today. That's terrific. Evansville, Indiana. All right, excellent. Yeah, so this kind of the response you've put in the chat have kind of borne out what I found in my research, that there's that this is a very Jewish occupation. That for some families they have no connection, and people are surprised to hear that there's a Jewish connection in scrap. And for other people, they're like, oh yeah, we've got lots of people in that all over entire states and so forth. So kind of a classic formulation. So thank you so much for your contributions. All right, so scrap in Madison. I mentioned the Cook brothers already. They seem to have been really kind of the pioneers of this. And scrap initially, the way that the Jewish people got into scrap was the same way that Jewish people got into opening the clothing stores and department stores and general stores that I talked about previously, and that was through peddling. The great thing about scrap, from a peddler's perspective, is that by the late 19th century, the people's ability to sell stuff door to door was kind of fading. I mean, that's always hard work. I mean, any of us who've done that kind of work for whether for our living or just the simple act of like selling stuff for a Boy Scout or Girl Scout troop or for your marching band or whatever kind of fundraiser, you get a lot of doors slammed on you. Turns out a lot of people are not eager to just buy something, from some stranger who knocks on the door. But by the late 19th century, there was a huge demand in the United States for steel. There was a huge demand for paper. And if you know your environmental history, you know that during that same period of time, huge forests across the northern United States, the North Woods of Wisconsin, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, upstate Western New York, that these forest lands were being clear cut, and the timber takes a while to grow back. So paper companies had to go farther and farther afield for trees to be pulped and made into paper, and similarly in metals. Iron deposits of the Allegheny and Appalachian mountain chain were becoming exhausted. It was harder and harder to extract the iron from the ground, and so steel mills were looking for sources of inexpensive iron that could be used to make steel. Well, the process of melting down iron to reuse it was known for hundreds of years. This was not complicated. The question was, who would actually go out and get this material? And the answer, the scrap deal, was peddlers. So peddlers beginning in the 1890s often kind of went out with a stock of goods and asked people if they wanted to buy like reading glasses, dime novels, needles, thread, those kind of small items that are easily portable. But they'd also kind of keep their eye open for things that might have fallen into disuse. For peddlers working in rural areas, if they saw like old plows rusting in a field, they'd then ask, if they made their pitch and people bought or didn't, they'd say, well, I happen to notice like a plow in the field on your property. Can I buy that off you? Can I buy that? I want that. And people would often look at this and they'd say, well, I can't sell that to you. It's worthless. It's a piece of junk. I'll help you take it away. I'll load it on your wagon so you can get it out of here. Yeah, I forgot to do that. Peddlers collecting paper could, if they saw like bundles of old newspapers or catalogs or things, could ask, can I buy that paper off you? And similarly, people would say, I'll pay you to haul it out of here. I don't want this around. So scrap became a lucrative field for Jews to go into across the United States, and especially in Madison. By 1910, 10 of 11 people listed as junk dealers, using the somewhat loaded term of the time, 10 of 11 of them in the Madison City Directory were Jewish, were members of Madison's first congregation. Early oral histories of pioneering Jewish families in in Wisconsin, in Madison. The Sonico and Sweet families, for those of you who have Madison roots, worked in scrap starting out. Some of the other great things about scrap from the perspective of Jewish immigrants was that there were lots of jobs that you could farm out to family members if you had a scrap yard. That first of all, you needed people to go out and collect. So if people were looking to work on their English skills, get out in the country and do that, they could absolutely go and collect. If there were people who didn't want to do that, or if they were kids who were going to be in school part of the day, they could go to the yard and they could sort. They could sort materials into different sorts of metals. Those jobs were definitely open. Down the line, scrap dealers came to specialize. They looked at what were the materials that were in demand in their city. Madison, unlike a lot of areas, didn't have like one particular kind of scrap. There were people who came to specialize in scrap metals and iron. There were people who came to specialize in scrap paper. There were people who came to specialize in hides and skins. From there, each of those kind of spun out into other areas. For people who dealt in metal, the Halpern family went from having a kind of mixed metal scrapyard into specializing in auto parts. That they found that people came by their yard looking for like a carburetor in a Model T, and they decided to specialize in auto parts. The Kalin family, who collected hides and skins, opened up a soap business. So refining the fats that they got from slaughterhouse leftovers and making soaps out of it. So scrap offered lots of opportunities for growth, lots of opportunities to employ family members new to the United States. Scrap also required like cheaper land than department stores did by the early 20th century. That the best possible land for scrap was a railroad siding. If there was a railroad that came by your property, you were golden. Lots of people don't want to live near a railroad. They don't want to open a store next to a railroad because it's going to be noisy. It's going to be sooty with coal-fired locomotives spewing smoke into the air. If you're running a scrapyard, that's all fine. You can take the iron, you can take the metals, you can take bales and bales of paper and load it onto trains and ship it off to the mills to be processed. Scrap, unlike businesses that relied on a more standard kind of customer base, scrapyards were easy to close on Shabbat and other holidays. The companies wouldn't expect scrap dealers to come and collect scrap, and people could take scrap to the scrapyard at some other point. So for religious Jews, it was much easier to run a scrapyard in many cases than it was to run some kind of store, where Saturday is the big business day of the week, and they always had to make the choice: do they work on Shabbat, or do they close the store and risk losing the massive business they're going to do on that day? So the second synagogue in Madison, Agudas Achim, which began holding services in 1899, built its building between 1904 and 1906, was again largely founded by scrap dealers. That scrap dealers, unlike the stock at a department store or a general store, scrap's not really portable. If you're buying a scrapyard, you're kind of committing to staying in that spot. It's harder to just sort of pack things up and move on. So the scrap dealer era in Madison, Jews continued to predominate in scrap through the 1920s and the 1930s. By the 1960s, the smaller scrapyards started to go out of business. There's several things that led to this. One of them that I've heard from several families I've talked to is that scrap is it's a difficult business. You're essentially gambling in real time with this commodity whose value can fluctuate widely. And that after World War II, when it was easier for Jews to get into universities and get jobs with their university degrees, the necessity of going into scrap, for a lot of families, it seemed like there were more consistent ways of making a decent living. Additionally, the industry itself consolidated. In the present day, I noticed there was at least one person in the crowd who had a connection to the Alter family of Davenport, Iowa. Alter scrap has just in the present day absolutely dominates the small scrapyards of the Midwest, including, I believe, almost all of the scrapyards in the Madison area that were owned by Jewish families. The ones that were still yards sold out to Alter at some point in the last 20 years. So the scrap era was fairly short-lived in Madison, but I think it's an important example of the evolution of Jewish communities, and especially the evolution of jobs that people worked that brought them to a particular place. All right, so from scrapyards, I want to, for the third segment of my talk, I want to talk about specialists. And the term specialists here, I was looking for something that was catchy that started with S, and specialists, to further break that down, I'm really talking about professionals. I'm talking about people who've gone into law, medicine, academia, the other professions. Because this, in the present day, this is really, if we're looking at Jewish occupations, this is where the bulk of them are. Absolutely, there are still Jewish families who own stores. Absolutely, there are still some Jewish-owned scrapyards out there. But especially in Madison, those numbers are real small, that there just aren't, those are not major areas at this point in time. But thinking about Madison community, there's professionals. I know lots of Jewish attorneys, lots of Jewish doctors and other health professionals. And of course, as Madison's a university town, lots and lots of academics. So this is also, though, as I mentioned, with like the combination between scrap dealers and shopkeepers, this is also not a perfect sort of segment, a perfectly sectioned off period of time. For instance, in the 1870s, in the initial Jewish congregation built by the German and Bohemian Jews who came here, Jacob Mack, who came to Madison in the early 1870s as a physician, was one of the last members of that early congregation. So early on, there was a Jewish doctrine. Also, his name, Isaac Moody, a dentist in Madison. So there were Jews in healthcare really from the 1870s. In the early 20th century, Samuel Schein, who originally was trained as a rabbi and served congregations in Lynchburg, Virginia, and elsewhere before coming to Madison. Schein arrived to become the rabbi of Agudas Achim, but instead completed his law degree and practiced law until his death in the early 1950s, was kind of the go-to Jewish attorney for many people in early 20th century Madison. If we're talking about Jews at the University of Wisconsin, the first Jew to attend UW started in 1861. A man named Philip Stein, who graduated in 1865, came back for a law degree in 1868. Stein was the first known Jewish graduate of UW-Madison and serves as a great example of that. Stein remained active in the Wisconsin Alumni Association. In fact, his photo is on the cover of a 50th anniversary, the publication of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, their 50th anniversary issue. He's got the cover story. He talks about his time at Madison, obviously as apparently the only Jewish student there at the time he attended. There's no Jewish life that he spoke of, but Stein was active in Jewish organizations in Chicago. He was a huge member of B'nai B'rith. He hired other Jewish attorneys for his law firm there, and really is a great example of someone blazing that particular trail. There were a handful of Jewish students who attended the UW in the 19th century, a few from Madison, a few more from Milwaukee, but there wasn't really any organized Jewish life on campus until 1911. That's the year that Horace Callan, who was the third Jewish professor at UW, Callan came to Madison from Harvard, and he brought the concept of the Menorah Society with him. Callan, who followed in the footsteps of Joseph Jastrow, a psychology professor who came to UW in 1886, and Bell Flesch, a lecturer in speech who held that role in the early 1890s. Callan was the first Jewish professor to really bring some sort of Jewish life to campus. Callan was the son of a rabbi. He was born in Russia, came to the US as a 4-year-old, so very American in his upbringing, but he still had some roots in traditional Judaism. The Menorah Society under Callan became the sort of all-purpose Jewish organization. It's for historians looking back, looking at the Menorah members recorded in the yearbook and in their papers in the Wisconsin Historical Society. It's an easy way to get at the beginnings of a Jewish community life on campus and the idea of Jewish college students in this city. The Jewish presence at UW remained pretty small until the early 1920s, when several things came together to really increase the number of Jews coming here. First of all was the University of Wisconsin itself. Then in the early 1920s, the leadership at UW-Madison wanted to sort of change Wisconsin's image, change their purpose from a land-grant college that educated the farmers and the engineers and the teachers of the state to really an internationally focused university, to a modern, internationally focused research university. And so as part of that, they wanted to, the university grew in numbers over the course of that time. The 1920s also was the beginning of college as a kind of expectation in Jewish families. The Jewish students who came to UW before 1920, and even Jewish students on campus in the 20s and 30s, were often expected to go for a couple of years and come back to the family business and just help their parents run it better. That by taking a few business courses, people figured that their kids could help them run a more effective grocery store, a more effective clothing store, a more effective scrapyard. And that college as the expectation and graduating from college the expectation. This is something that was a few decades off. But in the 1920s, that shift began to happen, often for people sort of like Horace Callan, who were either born in the United States to immigrant parents, or people who had come to the US as little kids, and then for their children, wanted their kids to get college degrees and go into work where they could use those degrees that they had picked up. The other big factor that really increased the Jewish presence on campus that worked together with these other existing trends was that in the early 1920s, this is the period of time when universities in the Ivy League, except for Penn and other colleges that were kind of Ivy adjacent, began excluding or restricting the number of Jewish students who could go. For leaders at UW in the mid-1920s, they looked at the university they were trying to create. They looked at kind of ongoing skepticism of higher education among especially rural Wisconsin residents, that Wisconsinites were kind of slow to agree to send their kids to Madison for 4 years instead of having them work on the family farm or in the family business. And looking at the plight of Jewish students in the East, where over 50%, if we count the area, the whole corridor from Boston to Washington, D.C., we're looking at 70% of the American Jewish population in the 1920s were all those Jewish people between the ages of 18 and 22 who wanted to go to college, were living in states that didn't have robust state university systems, that they would need to go to private colleges that were often exclusionary. Wisconsin seemed like a great option. So Wisconsin at that point became a destination for out-of-state students. And that led to some conflicts in the 1920s. Even though the UW was really welcomed Jewish students to campus, UW had the second Hillel Foundation in the country going back to 1925. As well as half a dozen Jewish fraternities and 2 Jewish sororities by 1930, as well as an experimental college that tried to mimic the draw of a small liberal arts college, the intense intellectual atmosphere of that sort of college within the confines of the Madison campus. Despite these amenities, Madison landlords, there's no fair housing law in the books. And Madison landlords were notoriously skeptical of renting to Jewish students. So that's kind of the first anti-Semitism that Jewish students encountered was difficulty getting rooms. Oftentimes, Madison landlords made the call of who was Jewish and who was not by their accent. So there was a notable case in 1929 where Mildred Gordon, a student from Chicago who was entering her third year at UW, signed reserved a spot in an apartment building just off campus. And then when her parents, who were Russian Jewish immigrants, came to help her move in, it was at that point that the receptionist in the apartment building said, yeah, we can't let you lease an apartment here. Like, no, you just can't do that. And she complained, she sued the landlords of the apartment building, lost the suit, and withdrew from college. So this case really kind of put this peculiar position of Jewish students in the spotlight. That Jewish students were able to come to Madison, but they had a hard time renting rooms. From there, Madison's Greek system organized like a separate set of activities to exclude the Jewish fraternities and sororities. So it's sort of like a pan-Hellenic organization for everybody except the Jewish fraternities and sororities. As students debated why this was going on and what the cause was and how to fight it, there was a split on how to respond. The growing Jewish student population from out of state urged the campus Jewish community and its Hillel to take an active stand about this, to call out this sort of discrimination in the United States in 1930. Jewish students who had grown up in Madison, in Wisconsin, in much of the small town Midwest, generally counseled a more quiet form of negotiation of trying to find a way to get Jewish students a place to live, to get Jewish students equal treatment in the classroom. So this kind of tension between in-state and out-of-state Jewish students, and those of you from who went to college here, I'd be eager to hear your thoughts about this. It's something that in my history of the university has kind of fluctuated over time. It seems to run in cycles. There are periods of time where no, there's no real rift, and there are times where absolutely there are rifts within the campus Jewish community. During this time, though, as tolerant as the UW was for bringing in undergrads to go to college here, the same was not true for most graduate departments and certainly for faculty. The number of Jewish faculty at UW remained in the single digits through the 1920s. The UW engaged in a kind of tokenism for truly exceptional intellectuals who happen to have Jewish background. Selig Perlman, the noted labor economist, one of the founders of the discipline of labor history, is one of those examples. Perlman just had a unique background. He was born in Bialystok in Russia. He was active with the socialist movement there. He fled Russia to go to school in Naples, Italy, where he encountered some vacationing American socialists who put him in touch with John Commons, the economist at University of Wisconsin. Perlman came to Madison then as a Russian immigrant in 1908, completed his bachelor's degree and his PhD at UW, and after working for the US government for a few years, came back in 1918 into the economics department, where he stayed for the next 40 years until his death. Perlman, however, was like the only Jewish economist, especially full-time economist forever. In 1940, a guy named Milton Friedman got a job as a lecturer at UW-Madison. And Friedman, in his memoirs and interviews, made it clear that he was told there was room for one tenured Jewish faculty member on the economics faculty at UW, and that was Zelig Perlman. That was not going to be anyone else. So a limited number of Jewish intellectuals actually taught at Wisconsin during this time. Also, Jewish graduate students were kind of scattered around. There were a fair number of Jews who worked in emerging scientific areas, in theoretical physics, in pharmacology. These areas had a Jewish graduate student presence and some other Jewish faculty. But in more established disciplines like history, there were like no Jewish grad students in history until like the 1940s, and very few Jewish faculty. The medical school at the University of Wisconsin, like medical schools in many places, also took only a limited number of Jewish students. So the situation for specialists, Madison was like the rest of the country. Jews who went to law school at UW-Madison, which was the law school seems to have been relatively accommodating to Jewish students. Jewish students at UW could absolutely go into labor law. That was a new field. That was an emerging area. There were lots of Jewish people working as labor lawyers already. That was fine. Jews could absolutely go into family law. That laws, as divorce became more common, there was a need for attorneys to guide couples through that process. That was a new area of the law, absolutely was open to Jews. Jews who wanted to go into corporate law, no, not going to happen. So there again, specialists could come out of UW, but only in certain areas. World War II, though, changed all that. There were Jewish students who were refugees from Europe who were admitted to UW, who thrived there. In 1950, George Mossey, himself a refugee from the Holocaust, who made his way to England, and then his first teaching position at the University of Iowa, came to Wisconsin in 1950 as the first Jew in the history, first Jewish professor in the history department. After World War II, the gates really opened up, and more Jewish people came to Madison for faculty positions, and the ground that had been blazed in the 1920s of Jewish students coming from out of state continued through the 1940s, the 1950s, the 60s, and on into the present. To bring us closer to the present, as I mentioned before, I think professionals really sort of dominate the show in Madison, as is the case in many cities. Apart from, actually, the exception to this is the liquor business. In the 1920s, Jews who had owned grocery stores as grocers, as Italian grocers, as American-born grocers, as German grocers did, grocery stores during Prohibition were sites where it was easy to have the raw materials to make wine and beer and bootleg whiskey. You've got produce that's going to go bad if you distill that and continue distilling it and age it and so forth. You've got alcohol. So there are a few grocer families in Madison who wound up, and it's always like 10 minutes after Prohibition ended, going into the liquor business that remain in that business today. And those are really the main businesses here that remain in Jewish hands, that are still that sort of Jewish entrepreneurial model. Otherwise, there are lots of professionals. State government also is sort of a unique to Madison and some other cities, that's been an area where Jews have been able to excel. And I think there's this sort of professional economy. It's also valuable for thinking about the trajectory of American Jewish life in the 21st century. That cities that had more of an industrial base, cities where scrap dealers were even more a part of local Jewish communities than was the case in Madison. A lot of those communities are in kind of serious decline. In smaller cities in Madison, like Fond du Lac, like Manitowoc, where the Jewish community and the scrap dealer community were really one and the same. Those are communities that have lost their synagogues, where the synagogues have gone out of business, or where the building still exists and a few people have keys to it, but there's no functional congregation there anymore. I think part of the story for the DC area, which has become continues to have a larger and larger Jewish community there, it's the professional opportunities in Washington, DC and its suburbs. That whether it's people working directly for the federal government, or working for contractors, or working for lobby shops, or working in other areas of law and medicine and so forth, it's the professions that are really supporting that. And cities like, or metropolitan areas like DC, as opposed to more industrial-based metro areas, are the ones where Jewish communities continue to thrive. I think this is part of the reason that Madison's Jewish community has continued to grow, has been its solid professional base. All right, I can see there's a bunch of people have kind of put stuff in the chat and the Q&A. So sounds like there's a lot of questions out there, so I want to get to answering them as soon as possible. Thank you for your interest in this talk, and I look forward to hearing your questions coming up next.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Pollack. That was very insightful and engaging. And there's so many people who are, have histories related to the area, which I'm sure you can check out in the chat and questions maybe after even the program. But and for those of you out there, feel free to go ahead and send more questions in now. We have a number of them, but there's still opportunity to send your questions. And so one question that has come up in many different forms so far, and it's actually a very common question that our speakers have received across programs is, it sort of relates to anti-Semitism. And so there's several questions, sort of several why questions. Why didn't the landlords want Jewish students in their housing? And why was there prejudice against Jewish professors and grad students in corporate law, as one of the examples? And I guess the sort of a more broad question is how accepting or not accepting was the Madison community, both university and the greater community, I guess through different time periods. There's questions asking about like the 19th century through today.
Excellent, great. So I'll take those three. I want to start just kind of going in the order that you set out there. I'll say a few more things about landlords. So yeah, if you look at sort of like American popular culture and in other areas also, I mean, the discipline of social work, this kind of pops up, like kind of local charity networks that existed before the expansion of government assistance. There's a sort of stereotype that Jews were not good at maintaining their property, that Jewish households were crowded and dirty, and that sort of slid into a perception among many Madison landlords that Jews then would not be good tenants, that they're the sort of tenants who would trash the apartment rather than keep it functioning and so forth. I think a lot of the stereotyping, and again, it's why looking at the housing history in Madison is really complex, and why it's also, Jews did not have as hard a time securing housing as, say, Black students at UW did, which was like a whole other like level of difficulty, was that Jewishness was often tied to accent, that it was, or to a Russian sounding last name. One of the things I did as part of my research on like Madison in the 20s was I looked at B'nai B'rith magazine, which I thought was like a great way of getting sort of like a non-denominational or like multi-denominational look at Judaism, or really just as Jewishness more than that. And the B'nai B'rith magazine, kind of aiming for like a middle to upper class readership, is full of short stories that like focus on like Jews trying to assimilate in really kind of drastic ways, of changing their names. There's a great little short story about a Jewish guy named Levi who changes his name to Llewellyn. So, because he figures it's got the same letter in it, but it looks Welsh and he can pass for Welsh, but in the story, of course, he doesn't. So there's stories with like ridiculous name changes. The 1920s also, thanks to techniques perfected during and after World War I, the 1920s are the beginning of the nose job. And so the B'nai B'rith magazine has a bunch of stories of a doctor named Dr. Naselheimer, sort of a Jewish physician who specializes in altering the noses of the people who, of Jewish people in his practice. So for Jewish people who had anglicized their last names, or who came from England and didn't have Russian names at all to start with, for Jewish people who didn't look Jewish, whatever that means different things at different times. Certainly as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy with a solid Midwestern accent, I get that a lot in Jewish spaces. So for people like that, like landlords are like, yeah, okay, whatever, I'll rent a room to so-and-so. But for somebody with a name that sounded more Jewish, or especially for students who spoke with an accent, or in the case of Mildred Gordon, if their parents showed up at any point during the leasing process, that flagged them as Jewish, and then boom, that was right out. So the prejudice was, I think, really, it was kind of a combination of like a prejudice against Jews and a prejudice against immigrants. The same kind of thing holds, I feel like there's some confirmation in that looking at Madison neighborhoods. Within Madison, there are two neighborhoods, a couple neighborhoods that remain like very fairly expensive neighborhoods to live in. Maple Bluff on the city's east side, where the Wisconsin governor's mansion is, and Nakoma on the city's west side. Both of these are kind of suburbs that grew up. Well, Nakoma's within the city, it's a suburban area. Maple Bluff is a separate suburb. They grew up kind of around country clubs. And so when I started this research and I talk about it, people say, oh yeah, Jews were always excluded from da-da-da until such and such a year. And I say, actually, no. There were a couple of brothers, the Barron brothers, who lived in Maple Bluff in the late 1920s when it was being platted out and built up. They ran a major department store in downtown Madison, and they came to Madison from a store they ran in Mitchell, South Dakota, home of the Corn Palace. So the Barron brothers, having been born in South Dakota or moved there as little tiny kids, spoke with like a South Dakota accent. Nobody thought to really look too hard into their religious. They weren't active in Jewish life really in Madison. It's not like they were wearing a kippah to work or something like that. Going off to daven 3 times a day. Like, no, not what they did. So they passed and they were able to buy in Maple Bluff. Similarly, the manager of their store, Joe Rosenthal, came to Madison from Corsicana, Texas, to run the store when the Barron brothers moved to California. And he was able to buy in Nakoma. Again, he came across as this Texas guy who ran a department store. And yeah, okay, maybe he gave to Jewish causes or something like that once in a while, but it didn't really register the same way. So I think that's where like the housing restrictions kind of came from. Jews who were born in the United States, or who came here as little kids and spoke without a Yiddish accent had a much easier time than those who didn't have those things. To the second question on anti-Semitism, prejudice in the professions and the reasons for that. Honestly, we still kind of see some of this coming back. It's something that I thought was gone for a long time, but I feel like in the last few years, we're seeing kind of a renaissance of it. That there's, looking at like my field, looking at the field of history in general, and the field of U.S. history in particular, there's a strand of anti-Semitism that talks about that's anti-Jewish because Jews are seen in that as in some historical frameworks, Jews come across as rootless cosmopolitans, as Jews who are not fixed to a particular place, who don't have deep roots in farming in a particular area and living there for hundreds of years and so forth. And I think many of the professions, starting with US history, there was an idea in the historical profession in the early 20th century that the people who are best placed to write about and research and teach the history of the United States were those people who had a direct line back to the founding generation in the 1700s, if not the Mayflower before that. And that anybody afterwards, no matter how hard they studied, no matter how much they read, no matter how much they thought about it, no matter what their analytical powers were, there was like an essence of being American that Jews who had come to the US relatively recently would not be able to capture, and therefore were unfit to teach American history to anybody. I feel like other professions, law, medicine, things like that. Also, there was an idea. No, these are things where you need to have this deep connection with the people you're with, and Jews who are more recent arrivals wouldn't have that. So I think that's where the professions came from. I think also though, and lots of people have written about this, that there's been like a connection between Jews and modernity for a long time. So in fields that were more modern, for example, even looking at languages. So languages like Latin and ancient Greek, that were the foundation of American education, both like high school and higher education through the 19th century. No, those are not Jewish languages. It was very rare, if not impossible, to find a Jewish professor of Latin or Greek. But Spanish as a university language is relatively recently. For those of us who took college Spanish, for those of us who might have majored in it, or if kids who majored in it, really and truly, like a university offering Spanish in the 19-teens, 1920s, that's kind of cutting edge. That Spanish really came on as an important university language during that time. And At Madison, one of the first professors of Spanish was H. Hanan Berkowitz out of Philadelphia. So Jews could absolutely teach languages like Spanish that didn't have this deep legacy in American universities, but the Latin and Greek, like, no way. Classics, no, not going to happen until after World War II. Let's see. Third question on anti-Semitism before I move on to more. How accepting were non-Jews in Madison at different points in time? It's a great question. Yeah, I kind of touched on that, and I sort of like I lost those notes or something. So thank you for bringing me back to it. What I think is really interesting, so it's kind of starting with the initial generation, Jews who came to Madison between roughly 1850 and 1880, who primarily, but not entirely, came from Germany and the modern day Czech Republic. Like I said, in most contexts, they really seem to have just been part of the German community. Madison during this time had like what I would call like a Yankee community, like native born Americans whose families had been in the US for 100, 200 years before coming to Madison, ancestry in the British Isles and so forth. There's a big Norwegian community where Norwegians started coming to Madison in the 1840s, and a big German community where Germans started coming to Wisconsin in the 1840s as well. So within that kind of setup, Jews were kind of folded in with the other Germans. Jews were absolutely part of German singing societies, Masonic lodges, as I mentioned. They were on the boards of banks that like served German merchants and so forth. Even in the credit reports, lots of credit reports kind of take note of a particular merchant as being German. And then it's like in September or October when they close their store for Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, then they show up as Jewish. But before that, they're like German merchant, does a good business, very quiet about their background or how much they have, et cetera. But it's always like they're German first and Jewish second. So that's generally the case, I would say, in the for that first generation. For the Jews who came later on, also, again, aside from real estate, which continue to be a problem, as I mentioned, Jews, especially those with accents, found their neighborhoods they absolutely could not buy in for love or money. But also, as I think is the case in lots of cities, like there are also desirable neighborhoods that Jews could buy in. That Jews were able to, so for example, in the early 1920s, Jews were able to build homes on Lake Mendota. They were able to build lakeside property near Tenney Park out on the east side as the subdivisions were being laid out. There were Jews in Madison's first like kind of suburban area within the city on the west side, Wingra Park, near close to the Madison Zoo, really close to both the Reform Beth El and conservative Beth Israel congregations. Jews were in Wingra Park from the beginning. There was no problem building there. And that neighborhood today has some absolutely gorgeous homes. They're massive, they're beautiful, they're one of a kind. So otherwise, there were Jews involved in other like service organizations in addition to Masons. There are Jews involved in like Madison Rotary going back to the 1920s, other kind of public lodges like that. So generally the public, pretty accepting, pretty tolerant. It's generally been a decent place for Jews to settle. There wasn't a powerful like German American Bund influence within Madison. That organization was based in Watertown, about 45 minutes away. But they really gained no, kind of American Nazi organizations gained little traction here. The Klan in Madison, kind of a joke in a lot of ways, not super successful. And the Klan in Madison largely directed its attention toward the Italian immigrants in the city. Italians and Jews basically shared the same neighborhood on Madison's very near west side, known as the Greenbush. But in Madison, when Madisonians talked about the crime in the Greenbush or the people who live in the Greenbush, it was always kind of coded Italian. Like Jews didn't really register as being in Greenbush, and in point of fact, between 1920 and 1930, Jews got the heck out of there. Italian community really stuck around that whole time, even though the Greenbush was the location of Madison's synagogue, and then like a second synagogue as well. Jews still moved out to other neighborhoods a few blocks away. There have absolutely been incidents of anti-Semitic graffiti in Madison at different points of time for different reasons, as every city has. But I would say in general, it's been anti-Semitism has been relatively minor, and in the wake of anti-Semitic incidents, there's often been an outpouring of support from the non-Jewish community for Jewish organizations and Jewish people within the city. Great set of questions. I kind of, like I said, I really jammed on that one for a while. So Matthew, what else have we got?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's great. That was very informative for everybody. And I think that answer the questions on sort of anti-Semitism there. I want to say before asking this question, or ask you before going to the next question, there's a number of questions that people are asking that are very specific to their family. And I just want to know, are you comfortable maybe after the program if we send those questions to you, or are you comfortable being in touch with people?
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, yeah, you're right. I'm seeing a lot of family names kind of popping up in the chat. And there's still almost 200 people here. So I can't, if you all email me, I can't guarantee I'll get back to you like ASAP. But I would love to hear from you. I mean, those are great stories. And I'm also, I'm kind of fascinated. As I mentioned before, Madison is a city that a lot of people sort of pass through. And so I'm curious for like where people go, like what is the next step? Like, are there, if we were to go back, there's specific, like the shtetl of Kapulya in present day Belarus, near Minsk. Kapulya is really like the shtetl where like the early Jewish settlers in the 1890s through about 1920, that's where people came from. It was a case where that was kind of like a myth. I thought it was kind of a myth because people said, oh yeah, everybody in Madison came from Kapulya. And I was like, yeah, right, sure they did. And I looked more closely at like immigration records, and I found, no, there's like all these towns and so forth. And then I plotted them on a map, and they were like, whew, a radius right around Kapulya. So there's definitely a pipeline there in the early, about 100 years ago and 120 years ago. And I'm curious also, are there similar kinds of things that exist from Madison to place X? Are there networks where Madison Jews all tend to go when they're tired of Madison? Just a quick request to spell the shtetl. It's usually so historic, like in transliterated Yiddish. It's what is it? Kapule is how I've seen it rendered most often, given there's differences in how we transliterate Yiddish. If you're looking at it on a present day map, if you go to Google Maps and try to zoom in on Belarus, it's going to be rendered as KOP, I think apostrophe YL in Belarusian. So that's the shtetl. Like I said, it's it's near Minsk. It's the largest big city to it, and that's really where a lot of the early Jewish families who are currently in Madison, families who came here in the 1890s, first couple decades of the 20th century, that's where they trace their ancestry to Kapulya and kind of other smaller shtetls in that immediate area.
Great, thank you. And yeah, the audience, there's probably a wealth of stories and information, it sounds like, from the comments. And
yeah, it's one of the things. I mean, it's why I'm really sorry to have to do this on Zoom, because if I'm giving a talk live, like the Jewish geography segment at the end is always the best. Like people come up and I'm like, oh, I know someone who lives in your grandma's house now, and stuff like that. Yeah, that's always a blast. And like I said, it's much just harder to do in this format. All right, what other questions we have?
You mentioned, going back to one of the things you said before, you mentioned, the Black community, and there are a couple of questions about the relationship to the Jewish community and minorities in the Black community. If there's anything you want to add to that.
Sure. I'm just taking a note of that. Yeah, I mean, so looking at the sort of history of Jews in the Black community of Madison, I mean, early on, I haven't been able to find like any connections at all. I mean, there's the first Black residents in Madison came here in 1847, so actually predating the first Jews to settle in Madison by a few years. Madison's Black community, I'd say, is even more transient than its Jewish community. That people tended to move in and out more often. Similarly, African Americans in Madison in the 19th century were were often kind of zoned into certain occupations, especially barbering was a huge trade for African Americans in the mid 19th century, really until large numbers of Italian immigrants came to the United States and kind of moved Blacks out of that niche in many areas. But yeah, I'm not really seeing any connection one way or the other between Jews and Blacks until I want to say like the 1930s. But by the 1930s, especially at UW-Madison, Jewish students and the much smaller Black student community got together to try to move the needle on the housing issue. That both these groups found that they were, constantly discriminated against in housing, and they pushed the city to do something about that. These efforts kind of began in the 1930s, picked up again in the 1940s, picked up again in the 1950s, and then by the early 60s, some changes came along. So housing was an issue that brought Blacks and Jews together. I guess also a little bit earlier than that, I mentioned the Greenbush neighborhood. That was the main Jewish neighborhood in the early 20th century, and the main Italian neighborhood. It was also one of three really early Black neighborhoods in Madison. And even there, what's kind of interesting about it is one of the things I've heard when I've talked to older Madisonians who grew up in the Greenbush neighborhood, is I've talked about it in really like idealistic and nostalgic terms. That there were, Jews and Blacks lived right next to each other, and there was no prejudice, and everybody got along. But looking at it more closely, it's like, even though the Greenbush neighborhood was really tiny, it's about, I want to say about 9 blocks roughly, 9-10 blocks, and fairly small blocks at that. African Americans in the 1920s and 30s really lived on like one street. There are 2 streets that the Jews lived on. There were like 3 streets that were Italian, and you don't really see much crossover. You don't really, there's like 1 or 2 Black families maybe are living in like a 2 or 3 unit apartment, and there are Jewish families in other units. But they're really kind of separated, even though the distance the people are separated, like I said, they're like very tiny city blocks. So Greenbush neighborhood was one area. Somebody pointed out the connections in scrap. Yes, that's absolutely true. Scrap yards in Madison, the surrounding areas, employed Black and also like early Latino migrants to the area, working in scrap yards as they no longer wanted to actually do the work of sorting the scrap metal, operating the blow torches and the other equipment, and so forth. And then from there, by the 1950s and 60s, Jews in Madison, as is the case across the country, got involved in civil rights movements, got involved in fighting housing discrimination, as I talked about before, and fighting for civil rights more broadly, both within Madison and the community at large. Andrew Goodman as the example of that, one of the 3 civil rights workers killed in the Mississippi burning case in 1964, came out of UW-Madison, having spent a year here as a student in 1961. Madison's Hill directors in the 1960s, Max Tickton, and I shouldn't have started naming names because I'm blanking on it. Shoot, someone is going to put that name in the chat, I imagine. Dick Winograd, there we go. Were super activists. They took students on trips to marches in the South. They encouraged their students to speak out on civil rights in Madison and beyond. And so those partnerships really thrived. I think some of the partnership between Jews and Blacks on campus, those connections frayed a little bit in the late 1960s and especially the early 70s, as Black activists on campus really took the side of the Palestinians in the conflict between Israel and Palestine from 1967 onward. That created a rift between Jewish and Black activists on that particular issue. In the more present day, there have been several kind of ad hoc groups of Blacks and Jews who get together on a regular basis to have dinner. There have been good connections between rabbis at Madison congregations and their counterparts in Black Baptist and Methodist congregations in the city. synagogue I belong to in the present is undertaking a really large and hard work with a local Black foundation on issues of racism that persist to this day in Madison and elsewhere. So that's been it's a long history throughout really the 20th and 21st centuries.
Great, thank you. We're going to move on to a different subject here. There's a few questions about different denominations that exist in Madison, and sort of reminded me of, you mentioned at the beginning that some people got into the scrap business because of Shabbat observance. So there's questions about how one question is when was the first Orthodox synagogue in Madison? There's also questions about more recent times, such as what does the community look like today? How many members are there that are active in synagogue life in general in Madison?
Okay, just jotting that down. Okay. So the first Orthodox shul, I think I thought I mentioned this, but maybe I went kind of quickly and skipped it a bit. That was a Agudas Acham congregation that held its first services in 1899 and built its first building between 1904 and 1906. From Agudas Acham, that spawned a breakaway congregation, set up a congregation that got much of its initial sort of startup funds from a couple of bequests in people's wills to create an Orthodox conservative congregation. So this congregation was known as Beth Jacob. It ran from 1928 to 1945. For those of you who know Madison, the building where it held services is now the Quaker Meeting House on the Near West Side. So Beth Jacob was sort of the first conservative congregation. Its membership was largely the children of people who grew up at Agudas Acham. And Agudas Acham, I mean, it really was like, it was kind of like one of those Landsmannschaft shuls. I mean, it was really like all people from Kapulia. So even if you if you're like born in Russia and you came to Madison for a job, but you didn't come from Kapulia, your family was from Lithuania somewhere, your family was from Hungary maybe, or Austria, or Poland, or Romania, like the minchag is all weird. Like the tunes are off and they're not saying what they're supposed to say and they're putting this other stuff in there and everybody knows each other and they don't know you. So a lot of those folks who grew up in that started Beth Jacob in 1928. There was another offshoot, Adasia Shuren, that came about in 1939, lasted till about 1962 or 63. Adasia Shuren, the legend about it is it got its start when one of Madison's two kosher butchers at that time objected to the tax that kosher butchers had to add to help sustain the Jewish community. They had other arguments with the rabbi at that time and allegedly just like stood up during a rabbi's Dvar Torah and walked out and said, "I'm building a new building. Who's with me?" Many of the people who joined Adasia Shuren were Orthodox Jews who, again, did not have roots in Kapulia, who maintained Orthodoxy despite being born in the United States and going into the professions, that they were kind of the roots of that congregation. Madison's second Reformed congregation came about also in 1939, when largely American-born Jews started Temple Bethel. In 1940, they brought their first rabbi in, Rabbi Manfred Swarzensky, who was serving a synagogue in Berlin when he was imprisoned. And so Bethel was able to spring him out of Nazi Germany and bring him to Madison to sponsor his time here. So by 1940, Madison had, so that'd be two Orthodox synagogues, a conservative-ish synagogue, a Reformed temple, and a Hillel. So a huge amount of Jewish activity for a Jewish community of maybe like 2,000 people. This is quite a bit of split over time. Eventually, Agudas Acham became Beth Israel Center, and Adasia Shuren merged with that in 1963. Beth Israel was Orthodox and became conservative in the late 1960s, kind of a slow process. culminating around 1967, 68. Temple Beth El still exists. Beth Jacob also, when it folded in 1945, its members kind of split toward Bethel and Agudas Achim and Beth Israel Center. There's also Chabad in Madison that dates back to about 1977, when the first Chabad set up near campus and then moved to its current site just off campus in 1980. First Reconstructionist congregation in Madison goes back to 1989, still going. It's a good segue into what the community looks like today. So it's kind of the synagogue membership is kind of exponential. So there's roughly 150 families affiliated with a Reconstructionist congregation. There's roughly 300 affiliated with a conservative congregation. There's roughly 600 affiliated with the Reform. Beyond that, Chabad membership, as the case with Chabad, kind of varies. That's sort of what they do. And I would say the best estimates I have is from my time serving on the Jewish Federation of Madison back about 15 years ago, is the Jews affiliated with a synagogue comprise maybe 40% of the Jewish people actually in the city and the Madison metro area, and probably more like a third. There are quite a few Jewish people, including most of my Jewish colleagues at the college where I teach, are totally unaffiliated. And even live in parts of the city where there's very little like historic Jewish presence, and have like no idea that there are synagogues here. So those of you who are active in Jewish communal life, I'm sure that is a situation that Madison shares with quite a few other spots around the country.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that sounds like a pretty similar narrative to many places.
Yep.
Looks like we have about 6 minutes left here. I want to just ask sort of a lighter question. I'm not as familiar with the Midwest myself, but from some of the other regions we've looked at, sort of food and leisure activities have also sort of shaped the Jewish community, and the community is sort of like the greater community of the region. Takes on the Jewish community takes on some of the aspects of those of the greater community. So I wonder if there's some unique aspects of Madison, or even you can expand that out to Midwestern culture in general, or Wisconsin.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great. I think part of it is talking about, food especially, is that if there aren't a whole lot of Jewish people around, like you don't have a kosher infrastructure. Madison had kosher butchers beginning in about, I want to say like 1910 or so. There were a few people who were doing that. But that position also had a lot of turnover. Like they just don't show up from year to year. They moved on somewhere else. They quit butchering and they went into scrap. They did something else. So it started in 1911, and I think the last kosher butcher in Madison went out of business in like 1971. And like I said, all along, that was a hard road to go down. It was a hard way to make a living. Even when there were kosher butchers, it seems like it was kind of like a niche sort of thing that a lot of Jewish families in the Midwest and really around the country, just kind of like veered farther and farther away from any sort of kashrut. Kosher infrastructure in Madison currently is Trader Joe's. Hillel has a kosher restaurant attached to it, and that's basically it. That's been an issue with I belong to the conservative congregation, and it's been an issue when we've tried to search for a rabbi. The rabbis are looking, conservative rabbis expect to keep kosher. And it's like, well, yeah, so there's like the few cuts of meat you get at Trader Joe's, and a lot of stuff on the dry goods have hextures on them. And then otherwise you're going to Chicago or Milwaukee with a cooler and bringing back. So food, Jewish foodways, I think increasingly, I know like the Jewish South is one where there's a kosher gumbo and things like that. Or like, Cajun style matzo balls and things of that line. And Jews in the Midwest, I'm really hard pressed to think of cuisines that are like that. In Madison, I think when we get to like food and leisure, I think one of the things that really looms large is UW football. that there are all kinds of that people who are observant over the years have gone to all kinds of lengths to be able to attend football games on Shabbat. Because of course, college football usually played on Saturday. So what do? Times where UW was like, not on national TV and got like the 2:30 kickoff. That's easy. That's a no-brainer. You can go to shul on that one, go home and put on your red sweater, and you're good to go. At my synagogue, which is the one closest to the stadium, we're literally within earshot of it. So when there's a football game on Yom Kippur, that's a home game. That's really amazing. I mean, that is you've got we're in a student neighborhood, so you've got people doing keg stands as you're walking to shul, having fasted for 12 hours. They're grilling out bratwurst. It's really like a test of your commitment to the play. So I think that's a big part of it. Additionally, again, in my congregation, one of the things we've done, and other congregations are sort of picking this up as well, like we pregame our Friday night services. So people show up, can roll in at 5 o'clock and have a drink or two, and then take that into the Friday night Shabbat service. So I think Wisconsin's drinking culture is kind of part of its Jewish culture. But I think that's also something that's not unique to Madison. I think lots of congregations are picking up on that. They're having, cocktail and mixology sort of events, especially aiming at a younger demographic who's interested in that and can tolerate it. That I think those are the things that kind of define this particular community. Otherwise, I mean, in other communities around the Midwest I'm familiar with, and one of the interesting things about Jewish Cleveland is the Hungarianness of the Jewish bakeries there. The pastries are really Hungarian pastries to a greater extent than in other cities, where the Jewish community is more heavily like Russian or Litvak and so forth. So that kind of makes a difference. Cleveland also has coconut bars, a delicacy unknown in every Jewish community I know of, except for Australia. Coconut bars are a huge part of Australian Jewish food and also Cleveland Jewish food. Culinary mystery I've never figured out. So I think those are, and I did a paper a couple years ago on Jews in Cincinnati who cornered the tamale market in the early 20th century. That's one I still have to get back to, the combination of Jews and tamales in Cincinnati. Like, what exactly was going on there 100 years ago? It makes no sense, but I've got the documentation. So those are a few of my Jewish foodways things. Also, grist for future talks, perhaps, to this group by me or by other people who are more expert than I.
Yeah, that's great. Those are some great examples. And I hadn't thought about the football example, but I imagine that's pretty universal in the Midwest. Michigan.
Yeah, I would say like, right. Yeah, certainly in Ann Arbor, that was a factor. That's where I went to college. Iowa City, I'd imagine that's the case. I mean, it's also what is special about Madison. I don't want to say unique because off the top of my head, I can't say exactly where every like synagogue in a Big Ten city is relative to its football stadium. It's that like the synagogue and the stadium are like 5 blocks apart. That the Reform is like the Chabad is even closer. That's like 2 blocks to the stadium. Chabad has like students partying right next door to it. They share a driveway with a student rental house, and those kids are like out there drinking at 10 in the morning, right in time for services. So Chabad's got to deal with that. We've got to deal with that. Even the Reform Temple in Madison is a little bit farther. It's about a little over a mile from the stadium, but they're also like the parking gets all messed up, and you get people like kind of walking, to and from the stadium back there. So I'd say Big Ten football is a big part of the organized Jewish community.
Yeah, that's great. We're about out of time, so I don't know if you have any sort of concluding thoughts or something about Madison or Wisconsin or whatever you want to.
Yeah, I guess it's less specific to Madison and more specific to this particular group. Thank you so much for being part of this. I mean, seeing all the things you're putting in the chat, it would be the greatest thing if I were just out there and kind of like, working the crowd afterwards. That's the part I really love. That's a really enjoyable part of giving a talk for me. So thanks for asking those questions. I said, you can get in touch with me. I will respond soonish. Again, depending on the volume of email that I get, I don't want to write checks that I'm have my mouth right checks that I can't cash. But yeah, thank you for coming. Thanks for participation. Just out of the corner of my eye, I can see people who I know here in Madison, or I know grew up here and I've met once or twice. Rabbi Feinberg is in here. Like, that's incredible. It's like, he's legendary. He came to this talk. That's great. So just yeah, thank you for tuning in. Thanks for sticking with it, and thanks to the Haberman Institute for inviting me out here.
Yeah, yes, and thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. And like you said, our audience greatly enjoyed it. It's just so obvious from all the comments and questions. So so thank you again, and thank you all out there for joining us. And we'll send a follow-up with details on how to contact Dr. Pollack and any other information. So we look forward to seeing you at our next program. And thank you all again for joining us today. Have a good night.
Thanks. Have a good night.